Do you think, though, Trump will try to seriously undermine NATO if he feels that he's not getting his transactional benefits from it, unless certain nations, like you said, the non-Baltic states, the non-Eastern European nations, mainly sort of, shall we say, the med states, don't step up and fulfill their membership obligations? Do you think he can pull some strings, or this is just going to force Europe to do its own thing even more?
Europe should just do their own thing. The United States is not a reliable partner going forward in the future. A majority of Americans voted for an authoritarian, and this can always happen again. We have free and fair elections. Let's say Donald Trump peacefully leaves office in 4 years. We have a transition of power. Okay, well, in 8 years, this can just happen again. A different populist can run on a winning platform of nativism and isolationism. This is now supported by the majority of Americans.
Do you think a DMZ is even remotely a thing, or will Trump really try to push?
Ukraine is surrounded on 3 sides. How do you create a DMZ for the largest country on the European continent?
This is The Global Gambit.
How you going, guys? It's part 2, and we are back with Jake Broe, who needs no introduction. But in the first part, we were talking about more of the militaristic side and sort of Ukraine to Russia. What I want to do in part 2 is bring in a bit more of the international. We touched upon it, but now we're going to deep dive into it. Of course, the elephant in the room, or maybe I should say orangutan, given his face and color or complexion of Trump, we will touch upon a little bit later. But initially, I want to talk with Jake a bit more about Olaf Scholz, the soon-to-be no longer existing, or at least incumbent Chancellor of Germany. Germany has a snap election coming up in early 2025, and that will obviously have huge ramifications for the rest of Europe. Jake, how are you feeling about sort of, should we say, that phone call, if you've looked into it a little bit? Obviously, Zelensky didn't like the fact that Scholz spoke with Putin, but has sort of had to accept that. So, yeah, initial reactions to that development?
I think Olaf Scholz and the Germans have been very concerned about Trump returning to the Oval Office. So it is related to the election here in the United States. It is related to Trump. And the reason why is Germany does not have their own nuclear weapons. France, even if the United States leaves NATO, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but that's the nightmare scenario for NATO partners. But France has their own deterrent. The United Kingdom has their own deterrent. Germany, the other major industrial power of the EU and the NATO alliance, does not. And the Germans and the Russians have a very bad history. So if Putin were to go insane and want to start nuking some cities, Berlin is top of the list. So I think this is the nightmare scenario for security experts in Berlin. And Olaf Scholz, now that Trump has won, is trying to re-establish or normalize relations in some way with Moscow, which is insane, but it's their security, insecurities, or whatever you want to call it. So I don't think we need to give too much thought to this. Olaf Scholz is just doing what he thinks is best for his nation. I'm not going to be super critical of him.
I find that surprising, and I'll take up that baton then, Jake, because I think Scholz has been incredibly indecisive and so much of a fence sitter, a little bit like Antonio Guterres, as we touched upon, although I was surprised you were sort of somewhat, sparingly critical of him as well. But do you not think that the unwillingness of Germany or this government, if this was Merkel, right, or anyone else, if there would be more desire to give Ukraine greater support, and because of Germany's restraint, that has played into the hands of Moscow by extension? Or you disagree, and Scholz has done what he could with a bad hand, or something?
I guess when I read these headlines, when I take these news stories in, it's going through the filter of my nationality. I'm not European. I'm not living on the European continent. So for me as an American to, cast shadow on or throw stones at a European leader when we just elected Trump and Trump might potentially cut off all military aid to the United States, I'm trying not to be overly critical of allies who are just, what's the expression, CYA, cover your own ass. We don't know what's going to happen. I did see the headline, Germany just delivered their 6th Iris-T air defense system. Germany has done amazing help with financial, humanitarian, and even military. Yeah, like I said, I'm not going to be too overly critical on other leaders who are just trying to protect their own, doing what they think is best.
Fair enough. All right. I would love to say I'm European as well, but Brexit always makes that kind of awkward. So, okay, now we have the situation where obviously
Yeah, a
Trump.
little bit.
Yeah. So, yeah. Well, that I will persist that I am, or moonlight as a European viewers. What do you think? I don't know. I might drop a comment below. What do you think then about the relationship of Europe more broadly to Ukraine at this moment? From a US perspective, we're going to touch upon Trump after this question, but like, do you think Europe? This is going to be the kick in the rear that will finally galvanize the Europeans to do something more than they have been. We've seen a desire by European policymakers to prepare against the Trump administration, and that includes potentially shifting more funding from, I don't know, areas of energy, even to or even climate to defense. Do you think that that's actually going to happen now? And if the Trump administration reduces its support to Ukraine, the Europeans can effectively take up that slack?
Well, let's not use the word Europe and blanket everybody, because there's two Europes. I mean, there's Poland, the Baltics, and the Scandinavian countries that have been fantastic, and then there's kind of everyone else. And it's been 3 years. It's been 3 years. When you look at the population and the size of the economies of the EU and the G7 versus Russia standing on their own, nobody is giving free help to the Russians. The Russians are having to pay for all of it, whether it's coming from Iran, North Korea, China, Syria, whatever. So the Europeans on their own, without the help of the United States, have always had the capacity to do this. But it'd be like a real war. You would have to go into wartime economies where social services or whatever would be reduced temporarily in order to win this war. And Democratic leaders don't want to do this because you lose elections when your standard of living goes down. We've already seen election flips, for example, in Austria and Slovakia. We've seen the far right, which are friendly to the Russians, gain in Germany and France. The UK is really the only country that's somehow impervious to Russian propaganda. But everywhere else, the far right and people friendly to Russia have been gaining as inflation has been bad, economies have been stagnant, benefits have been reduced. So I understand why these Western leaders are hesitant to fully committing and giving Ukraine everything they need to win this war, because if they lose the next election and the far right takes over and they say, we think Kyiv is full of Nazis and the Russians are the good guys, it's tough. Like, democracy has its weaknesses, and the Russians are currently exploiting it.
I would point out about the UK that the when we had our election in the summer, Reform actually did quite well. Obviously, Nigel Farage being the bell end that he is, they got about 4 million votes, which would have actually been about 90 seats if it was a different political system. But because it's FPTP, or first past the post, they didn't do that well. So I do think that there is quite a strong, maybe not Putinist support, but a sort of desire for the war to end sooner, that sort of sentiment, I think. But one last question on this, though.
Would you say those people are pro-Russian, or would you say they're anti-immigrant?
I would say that they are sort of anti-neoliberals, globalist. They are, they want a more sort of greater representation of the working class. They think that, many people who voted for Trump don't necessarily support Trump. They're just fed up with the status quo of, the Democrat Party, or what they consider the elites, in my mind. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but I don't necessarily think it's based on either pro-Putin or anti-immigrant. I think a lot of them are anti-immigrant, but I think it's because they think immigrants are the source of all their issues, when really they're being played. That's what Brexit was about at the end of the day. Any thoughts?
You can't be pro-growth and anti-immigrants when your birth rate is below replacement levels. This is just a hard truth. This is why so many factions here in the United States overlook the southern border, because without illegal immigration, our population wouldn't be growing. If our population stops growing, our economy stops growing. I mean, this is a complicated issue, but yeah, this is a factor that led to a lot of votes for example, the Reform Party in the UK, and it's part of the reason why Donald Trump won here in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on this. My undergraduate, my specialty is population studies and migration particularly, but I'm here to interview you, so we've got to balance me whittering on about that. I certainly think that they're all interlinked, right? The desire for a reduction in immigration comes from a fear of loss of sovereignty. It comes from a dilution of identity, and that is preyed upon by individuals who are usually very charismatic, right? Populists can be a party, but it takes one specific individual like a Farage, like a Trump, like a Viktor Orban, to play to those sentiments. And ultimately, replacement migration can never be a supplement for a depopulation or declining population, right? It's just not possible because people eventually want to go home. Like the return migration is very high, and people come, they get economic skills, they learn a few things, and then they move back because they want to be in the area that they used to live. So I think there's a lot of misconceptions about just basic population science that people don't take into consideration, and it comes to the Ukrainian situation, obviously. But yeah, I think, moving forward, do you think that populism, well, for example, right, Moldova, let's use that as a case study here, right? That was a very classic case where it's very close, but the referendum and the election came out in favor of tilting towards Europe and the West, and Sadu, the re-elected leader, right? So what does that tell you about how close sort of Putinism is to infiltrating Western nations?
Well, Moldova is not on Russia's border. They've got these 2,000 troops occupying Transnistria, but Moldova is between Ukraine, which wants to join the EU, and Romania, which is in the EU. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make sense for Moldova to remain in Russia's sphere of influence when it's not even on Russia's border anymore. When Ukraine was a puppet state of the Russians, when they had Yanukovych in charge or whatever, it made more sense. But Moldova has no future unless they get into the EU. The section of Ukraine, Western Ukraine, is never going to be controlled or taken by the Russians. So why would you choose to be an island, isolated from the mainland, if you want to call Russia the mainland? So yeah, Moldova's future obviously is with the EU. And for people who have lived in poverty their entire lives, Moldova is a very impoverished country. They just don't understand what's coming. The economic benefits once they integrate, once they can get that passport and go live and work anywhere they want in the EU, investment will come, infrastructure will be developed. When you look at the economic miracle and boom of the Baltics and Poland, as soon as they got into the EU, the same thing's going to happen for Moldova. The same thing's going to happen for Ukraine. The Russian system is based entirely on corruption and preserving the status quo and the elite of Moscow and St. Petersburg. Why would you want to be a part of that when you can have real economic security and property rights and all the benefits that come with being a free and democratic society?
No, for sure. I think the one, I don't know if you'd call it a counterpoint, but sort of point that people have noted is that if it moves, I think it's the rate by which it happens, right? Integration, because Croatia did that. They joined the EU, but then they joined the Eurozone last year. But in that time, a lot of Croats have experienced huge rates of inflation, or they've been priced out basically because, you start getting European investment and that raises it in the urban centers. But for people living in the rural areas, they suddenly can't afford the prices. The price levels are just out of their means, and a lot of them blame Brussels for that. And so there's this sentiment. I think a lot of reason brings us back to the populist point, why people are against sort of Brussels sometimes is because they look at it as this bureaucratic.
Croatia is beautiful.
It is. It's stunning. Have you been?
People want to live on the Adriatic Sea. And I imagine there's a lot of Europeans from other countries buying up real estate and developing along the coastline. And yeah, unfortunately for native Croats, they're being probably priced out and pushed out of their ancestral homelands. It's not a good feeling, but
Yeah, I think
It
that's where
still is investment. It still is development.
no, 100%, and I think that's where the Kremlin plays upon that, doesn't it? They play upon those sentiments and say that it's European Brussels types trying to, oppress and take away your rights or something like that. I think, but talking of populism, let's Mr. Trump, right? So, is he going to, Jake? Is he going to end the war in 24 hours, or is it 48? I'm not entirely sure.
No. I'm convinced we're never going to get to the point where Ukraine rejects a deal. I don't see the Russians and Trump's foreign policy team, once they start talking to them, ever agreeing on anything. And I'll just give you 1 point. Let's go ahead and say the Russians take back Kursk. Kursk is not part of the negotiations. The Russians are claiming that the city of Zaporizhia belongs to them. The city of Zaporizhia today is 700,000 people. And for Trump's transition team, who don't care about people, don't care about this city, they're going to tell the Ukrainians, okay, yeah, Russia says this city is theirs. I guess 700,000 people just need to evacuate. They just need to abandon a city larger than my hometown of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. This is just insane to think about what the Russians are actually demanding. And as soon as they get into a room with competent, sane people, the next Secretary of State, I think, will be Marco Rubio. The next National Security Advisor will be Mike Waltz. These are not crazy people. Like, for the deep state MAGA Trump people, Marjorie Taylor Greene or Matt Gaetz or Tulsi Gabbard, those people live in a fantasy alternate reality where facts don't matter and people are irrelevant. But for actual people that live in reality, that know the hard truths, what the Russians are demanding is impossible. So they're the ones who are going to have to compromise. They are the ones to get a freeze in the conflict or sanctions to be lifted. They are going to have to give up on the idea of taking the city of Zaporizhia or retaking the city of Kherson on the other side of the river. They're claiming that as well. They're never getting across that river again, but they're going to demand it. And we're going to find out together in late January, early February, what happens when the talks break down. When Trump, who said he could get a deal in a day, doesn't get a deal. Because I don't think the Russians are going to deal with him. I think the Russians are expecting everything they've been demanding this entire time. And if they don't get it, they're just going to continue what they've been doing because Putin thinks he's winning.
But do you not think that that's slightly... I don't know. I mean, because from the other perspective that you can argue, Putin obviously has preferred Trump. He finds him more manipulatable. He's reactionary. And so for someone like Putin, who might not be master strategist, but he has a bit more of a brain on him than Trump in many ways, do you not think that might be a bit of a risk? Because Trump has said, or insinuated at least, that if Putin isn't willing to at least signal that he wants to commit to some agreement, that Trump will do a U-turn and basically just escalate or elevate the amount of support to Kiev. So do you not think that's a risky strategy for Moscow?
I hope Trump will change his language. And here's my bottom line argument to Trump supporters. Do you really want to return to a multipolar world in which the United States is no longer the lone economic and military hegemon of the planet? Do you really want to give up power or share power with a reinvigorated Soviet empire, Russian empire? Why would you allow Putin to retake the Baltics, retake Ukraine, retake Moldova, retake the Caucasus, Georgia, parts of Kazakhstan, whatever he wants, in order to make himself richer and more powerful? For the anti-deep staters, or whatever you want to call them, the conspiracy nuts, they repeated that propaganda of the need to return to a multipolar world to balance out the United States when Biden was in charge, when the Democrats were in charge. Now that they have complete power, they control the Supreme Court, they control Congress, there are no checks and balances, they can do whatever they want. And I've accepted that Donald Trump will be my president for the next 4 years. And I want good things to happen. I'm skeptical, I'm critical, I'm going to call him out when he gives in to his worst authoritarian tendencies. But he actually might be useful this first year. Now, specifically, how do we get MAGA to vote for additional military aid after they've been saying for the last 3 years that tax money should be going to help homeless vets in San Francisco or, hurricane relief? Like, there's been so much anti-Ukraine aid rhetoric on the right here in the United States that for them to then flip and then want to vote for it, it's possible. Trump changes his mind and flips positions on things so often, so fast. So that's a possibility. I don't think MAGA and Trump are ever going to vote for military aid again. But what they can do is use other agencies to actually enforce sanctions, apply more sanctions, go after Russia's shadow fleet, of tankers. There are other things that Trump could do in office to exert pressure on the Russians. And I argue after 3 years going on the 4th year of this war, Russia is extremely brittle. It's not going to take much more exertion and pressure from the G7 if they want to get serious to actually cause a collapse of the Russian state. Now, the Biden administration and Jake Sullivan have been saying, we don't want this. We need to contain the fighting to just Ukraine. We don't want to destabilize Russia. We don't want Russia to collapse. This could lead to the scenario of loose nukes and various warlords who all have nukes fighting over gas fields and gold mines and all of Russia's vast resources. But Trump might say, I don't care about that. Trump might say, I don't care about escalation management. I don't care if Russia collapses if they don't do what I want. This is the world we're heading into in 2025. You and I are going to be spectators, front row, taking it all in as it happens.
Well, as I said to you before we went on air, that I feel that we're almost in the we're working against the prevailing tide now, right? A lot of people who are pro Putin like to emphasize that they are, working against legacy media to dispel the lies and propaganda. But actually, that's sort of us now, right? We're working against, X completely. And Musk. And I did want to bring in that element of this, of the individuals, some of the individuals who will have influence in the direction of Russia and Ukraine, which is obviously, what do you think about the nominees? Not assuming that all of them might well remain in place, but as you said, Marco Rubio is, he's a bit more, should we say, reasonable. Matt Gaetz terrifies me, Gabbard. So can you give me your assessment of some of the key players in this and how you think they could influence the direction of the war?
Well, there's a Wikipedia page showing all of Trump's nominees from his first term that were never confirmed. If we go back to the 2016 election and the 2017 January Senate, the Republicans had like 52 or 53 seats, if I remember. So the Republicans had a majority in the Senate, and they couldn't even get a lot of Trump's nominees confirmed. Now, the exact same thing is happening today. As we go into 2025 January, we have a Republican-controlled Senate, and a lot of these Republican senators are just not going to vote for these Trump nominees. Now, some of them are scared. They're scared to oppose them, even though they don't want to vote for them. But a lot of these senators are just on their way out. If they're not standing for re-election for 6 years, because it's 6-year terms in the Senate, well, Trump's going to be gone by the time they run for re-election. He'll be 84 in 6 years. So for the senators who were just re-elected, they don't have to worry about their next election or being primaried by a Trump-endorsed candidate for 6 years. So if they want to vote no, they can. And then for a lot of other senators up for re-election in 2 years, well, Trump's not on the ballot. He can't help them. So they're going to be facing tough re-elections in a midterm year without Trump being on the ballot to carry them. And then when you think about, okay, well, the senator's up for re-election in 4 years, some of these people are retiring. Chuck Grassley of Iowa is 91 years old. How are you going to bully and tell a 91-year-old what to do and who to vote for? He's going to vote for whoever he wants to vote for. So I think Trump is going to have a lot of difficulty getting somebody who's been accused of child sex trafficking, Matt Gaetz, to be Attorney General of the United States. Tulsi Gabbard, who is obviously a Chinese, Russian, and Syrian asset. I do think our allies the UK, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the Five Eyes. They're going to tell the United States if someone like Tulsi Gabbard is in charge of intelligence sharing, then we're going to stop sharing intelligence with you. This is a conversation that Trump's going to get, and he's going to be annoyed. But I do think he tosses out these names to make his base happy. But here's the thing about Trump. He turns on everyone. Everyone who was for Trump at one point, eventually Trump turned on them, and now they're anti-Trump. All of the most prominent top commentators on, the cable news shows are former Trump cabinet members. When you think about people like John Bolton and Scaramucci and all these other people that said that Donald Trump was going to be the greatest president who ever lived, back in 2016 or 17. And, like J.D. Vance, they now compare him to Hitler. So Trump, I think, will turn on all these people, Matt Gaetz and Tulsi Gabbard, the people who have been most loyal to him, because he doesn't need them anymore. Use them and lose them. That's how Trump has treated people his entire lives. So I think these people that thought they were going to get these cabinet positions and have real power, Trump's going to take the path of least resistance to making his cabinet go, because there's other issues he cares about. And these people are going to be ignored. They're going to be sidelined. They're not going to get invited to the Mar-a-Lago Christmas party. And they'll eventually start being critical of him as well on social media. They all turn on Trump. Everyone eventually turns on Trump.
He looks so bad in that tuxedo cummerbund combination. My God. All right. So a couple more questions about this element. I've got an entertaining one about Musk and Trump in a minute, but I want to save that for the end. So NATO, though, obviously there's been a lot of threats about defunding of NATO, incapacitation of NATO. I don't think he's going to go that far. There was a big piece in Politico a few months ago that was, outlining maximalist, scary scenario, but I don't think it's going to go that far. Do you think, though, Trump will try to seriously undermine NATO if he feels that he's not getting his transactional benefits from it, unless certain nations, like you said, the non-Baltic states, the non-Eastern European nations, mainly shall we say the Med states, don't step up and fulfill their membership obligations? Do you think he can pull some strings there, or this is just going to force Europe to do its own thing even more?
Europe should just do their own thing. The United States is not a reliable partner going forward in the future. A majority of Americans voted for an authoritarian, and this can always happen again. We have free and fair elections. Let's say Donald Trump peacefully leaves office in 4 years. We have a transition of power. Okay, well, in 8 years, this can just happen again. A different populist can run on a winning platform of nativism and isolationism. This is now supported by the majority of Americans, and I don't see it getting better. I don't see it improving. So to my European friends, yes, create your own European continent's security apparatus, parallel and in cooperation with NATO. But NATO's function and purpose really only is going to be beneficial when a Democrat or somebody who believes in international cooperation is in charge. And we now know that this can fluctuate every 4 years. Trump is not going to leave NATO because he likes having power. He likes having authority. If you remain inside NATO, you have more say in preventing things, blocking things, controlling things. That's what Trump wants. So Trump's not going to leave NATO, but he is going to obstruct and confuse and create chaos. That's just what he does.
The second to last question then is, Mr. Trump wants to be seen as the person who oversees a sort of great reset of, the way that the West is treated, or the way that America is seen and acts and does whatever, right? And that includes in being able to be the person who ends the war in Ukraine. Now, one theory is that he's going to settle for a DMZ. I did an analysis of this in a video earlier on in the week. And this idea, for me, my personal perspective is that it feels a lot of good, sort of ticks a lot of boxes for Trump, right? This is I'm using this expression more and more. It's on all the American podcasts, right? Kicking the can down the road. We don't really use it in the British lingo, but it's, he wants to kick the can down the road basically by creating a DMZ. right? A DMZ sounds good on paper because it's demilitarized. So Americans who want an end to the war be like, well, it's demilitarized, right? But from a Trump perspective, Trump camp, they've dealt enough of a blow to the situation, right? Both sides have, quote unquote, demilitarized, or at least signed an armistice. And then it's not Trump's problem anymore. He can focus on China, which is obviously his primary focus. But that's not realistic to me, right? That doesn't mean that Putin's going to remobilize, he's going to remilitarize, and he's just going to try this again. So do you think a DMZ is even remotely a thing, or will Trump really try to push for a full-scale end to the war? But given that neither Ukraine nor Russia are willing to do that, because they're two surprisingly independent actors that Trump voters don't seem to recognize. So what happens then? The two both keep fighting, and then Trump's just like, where do you see this going? I guess it's just, you know.
So when we talk about a DMZ, the first thing that comes to Americans' minds is the only DMZ we know, and that is North and South Korea. But the Korean DMZ is 250 kilometers long. It's only 250 kilometers long, whereas the current front lines in Ukraine and Russia is 1,800 kilometers long, not counting Belarus's border, which Russia did invade from last time, and not even counting Moldova's border, where 2,000 Russian troops are hanging out in Transnistria. So Ukraine is surrounded on three sides. How do you create a DMZ for the largest country on the European continent, which is being threatened from three sides? So this is not practical. It sounds good to the average American because we don't understand geography, and we know there's a DMZ in Korea that seems to have been holding the last 75 years. So you're asking big picture, where do I see this going? And I've been consistent the last 3 years. This is only going to end in one way, and it's going to be some kind of economic or political collapse of the Russian system. There's a countdown clock somewhere, and we don't know what it is, but somebody is going to take Putin out. Somebody is going to lead a palace coup at some point. We're not there yet. Things have to get worse, and things will get worse for Russia in 2025. But when you think about the top 10% of Russians, the inner circle, the elite of Moscow and St. Petersburg, ask them the question, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? And 4 years ago, they had access to their super yachts. Solovyev had 5 Italian villas. He had secret children with a WNBA star in New York City. He was traveling there like every other month. It sucks. I mean, do the Russians, do the elites, do the well-off of Moscow and St. Petersburg really want a vacation in Pyongyang? Do they really want the future of their society having closer ties with Riyadh and Tehran?
Well, maybe they could get
do the people of St. Petersburg have in common with the people of Tehran?
Well, maybe they could get a great deal.
That's my
on
argument.
City, right? In Saudi Arabia, the Lion City, it's almost being from there.
Yeah, they're working on it. So, they just got to figure out, I guess, all the plumbing. They need to call some good plumbers to get some water to go that distance.
Yes. All right. Well, I'm going to put the same question, but sort of spin it on its head, right? You're saying the only viable answer to this, well, what happens, though, if Mr. Musk and Trump have an implosion, right? I've been reading reports that Trump is already getting slightly irritated by Musk hanging around Mar-a-Lago too much, right? I forget the name of his bloody resort, right? What happens there? You've got two megalomaniac narcissists who want to dominate the headlines and be seen as the de facto leader of this administration. That'd be quite entertaining, wouldn't it?
These two individuals have God complexes. They think they're above the law. They think they're above international norms. Trump and Musk. Honestly, I think Trump's first term in office is what radicalized Musk. I think between 2016 and 2020, Elon Musk, who was a normal businessman back then, normal as you can be, being in charge of a rocket company, but he watched how Donald Trump behaved while president on social media, and there were no consequences. Absolutely no consequences for anything. Donald Trump refused to have a peaceful transition of power, and he led an insurrection on January 6th in which people died. and there were no consequences. And with Musk's help, Trump is now back in power. And Elon Musk now views himself as the shadow president. I do believe that if Elon Musk hadn't bought Twitter and hadn't rigged the platform to favor conservative, right-wing, and Republican accounts, I don't think Donald Trump would have won. Donald Trump dominated the social narrative just with his wild antics and his bold statements, but a majority of Americans now get their news from social media. They no longer trust for-profit corporate media. And perhaps this is a good thing. Maybe more Americans should be getting their news from social media, but social media platforms now have a responsibility not to favor and promote misinformation and obvious propaganda, which is all that Elon Musk does. All day, every day, he does these stupid comments and retweets. Interesting. Wow. And it's mostly bullshit. It's mostly just fake information that can be easily disproven. So I do think Elon Musk is going to overreach, and Trump does not like sharing power or praise. He is never going to give Elon his laurels. And thankfully, blissfully for America, you can't run for president unless you're native born in the United States. So Elon Musk and Peter Thiel themselves can never run or hold the office. But I do think Trump's going to turn on him because Trump wants to do what he wants to do. He doesn't want to do what Elon or Peter Thiel want to do. So that fight is coming, and I think it's going to come after the midterms. I do think the Democrats are going to gain seats in the House. They're going to gain seats in the Senate in 2026. And when things start to turn, Trump's just going to blame Elon Musk. When you cut $150 billion in veterans benefits or whatever from the VA, this is what Vivek Ramaswamy is promising. Trump's just going to say, I didn't do that. Elon Musk did it. You lost those benefits. You lost those protections. You lost that paycheck because Elon Musk wanted to do it. And I was watching Fox News and tweeting on Truth Social. I had nothing to do with it.
That's a good point about the vets, actually. I hadn't thought of that particular example. I can't stand Vivek Ramaswamy. He's so, slimy. But yeah, no, and I think it's going to be very entertaining. I'm just worried about at the expense of Ukraine, if the situation hasn't sort of somewhat drastically changed by then. But Jake, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you as always for your time and energy and dependability, I think is a great word for you. You're very, I think reassurance, I think is something that people get from your videos. So it's always a pleasure speaking with you. And I look forward to doing more with you, be it live streams or recordings. And everyone else, thank you very much for watching. As we like to say, this is the Global Gambit, and you either got to get playing or be played. But otherwise, take care, everyone.